Once he was the most talented attorney in the city, then it was all taken away from him and he was left wandering the streets. But he found the power of faith. He had once been the most gifted associate in an elite law firm, dazzling senior partners with his quick intellect and a charm that could thaw even the frostiest boardroom. Success seemed to trail his footsteps as if it were his birthright, arriving in the form of impressive case wins that catapulted him from a novice attorney to a sought-after legal prodigy in record time. Early in his career, he believed that his confidence was a shield protecting him from the insecurities gnawing beneath the surface, and so he sharpened his wit, perfected his composure, and refused to let the slightest hint of doubt mar his pristine facade. Late nights in the towering office building felt like strategy sessions for conquest rather than grueling hours of work, and each closed case, each headline, each accolade fanned the flames of his ambition. He bought himself the kind of tailored suits that drew envious stares in the corridors, convinced that appearance was as crucial as knowledge when it came to dominating a courtroom. Drunk on the validation offered by mentors, colleagues, and influential clients, he grew bolder in seeking cases that straddled the ethical line, confident his unrivaled skill would always keep him untouchable. Ultimately, that same bravado led him to represent a powerful magnate shrouded in scandal, a figure rumored to operate in the murky waters between corporate legitimacy and organized crime. Rather than feel alarmed, the young lawyer saw it as a stepping stone to broader fame, telling himself that justice was malleable, that truth was a narrative he could craft with enough finesse. He spent hours reviewing documents that reeked of corruption, editing them with an eye for loopholes that would leave judges and juries reeling in confusion. Triumph came swiftly when he managed to free his client from staggering penalties, and his colleagues spoke of his courtroom performance as if it were legendary, repeating stories of how he dismantled the prosecution with surgical precision. Still, a nagging voice tried to warn him that bending the truth for the sake of victory was a recipe for inevitable downfall, but he silenced it with even more daring maneuvers, taking on cases that teetered on the brink of legality. He began to view the justice system as a grand stage where the most convincing performer would always come out on top, blurring the lines between morality and success. Invited to exclusive gatherings where he rubbed shoulders with industrial moguls and society elite, he felt unstoppable, forging a network that offered him not just financial security but the intoxicating promise of near-limitless influence. Fame turned his head, but the cracks in his gleaming public image were there, growing wider as certain journalists whispered about hidden payoffs and questionable alliances. He shrugged it all off, telling himself that the world thrived on rumor and scandal, and so long as he kept winning cases, truth would never catch up to him. Eventually, small oversights escalated into glaring misjudgments that an embittered rival exploited to provoke an ethics investigation, unveiling enough irregularities to make the profession recoil. His once revered name appeared in every major newspaper's headline, not as a legend of jurisprudence, but as a cautionary tale of hubris leading to ethical decay. The firm that once championed him swiftly severed ties, eager to distance itself from the fallout, leaving him to fend off the storm of accusations alone. He lost the majority of his influential friends overnight, receiving only polite condolences from the few who chose not to completely turn their backs. Courtroom victories and high-status connections dissolved like vapor, and his self-esteem collapsed beneath the weight of public scorn. Desperation drove him to defend himself with the same cunning he once reserved for clients, but the evidence was too damning, and his once impeccable reputation served only to highlight the magnitude of his hypocrisy. Though he fought fiercely, the legal community concluded that a professional as capable as he could not claim ignorance, and the judiciary demanded a steep punishment: disbarment, restitution, and a merciless public apology. Shame burned in his chest, sending him into spirals of anger and denial, cursing the system he once manipulated with such ease. His fortune vanished in a series of colossal penalties, bankruptcy filings, and legal fees that swallowed his substantial savings, toppling the comfortable lifestyle he'd worked so tirelessly to build. He was forced to sell his luxury penthouse, abandoning the sweeping skyline views for a cramped motel room where the TV flickered ominously, as if mocking his downfall. He tried to cling to the old sense of self-worth, but it disintegrated every time he saw his face in tabloids next to words like disgraced, fraud, and corrupt, words that tattooed themselves onto his identity. His parents, who had once bragged about his achievements, found themselves speechless under the judgmental stares of neighbors and friends, leaving him to grapple with the guilt of having tarnished not only his own name but theirs as well. Broken and disoriented, he wandered through days as if in a nightmare, replaying every decision that led him to sign forbidden documents or silence informants, haunted by the question of when exactly he'd gone astray. His pride rebelled against apologies or admissions of guilt, convincing him he could stage a comeback if only he found the right lawyer or the perfect counter-allegation. But as doors slammed shut and once trusted allies pretended not to know him, he realized his ability to bounce back was severely compromised by the extent of the corruption uncovered. A sense of dread crept into his mornings, fueled by sleepless nights of gnawing self-criticism, turning him into a man who questioned everything he had ever believed about success, talent, and ambition. He tried to find solace in alcohol, only to discover it merely intensified the loneliness, leaving him even more vulnerable to the despair that curled up inside his chest. Fearing the wrath of creditors and those seeking retribution, he ditched the motel once his dwindling funds dried up, clinging to the hope that he could evade his debts and start fresh somewhere else. With nothing but a few bags of clothes and scattered documents, he abandoned all that remained of his former life, stepping onto a road where people no longer recognized him as a brilliant attorney but saw him as just another face in a sea of lost souls. Friends became myths, phone numbers went unanswered, and every carefully curated social media profile transformed into a graveyard of unvisited posts. His self-image, once inflated by victories and ambition, collapsed into a hollow shell, leaving him to question whether he truly had any genuine relationships in the first place. Underneath the waves of regret, a faint ember of defiance flickered, whispering that he wasn't finished, that he could still prove his worth if only given another chance. But without money, powerful advocates, or a bar license to sustain him, reality sank in. The mighty fall just as hard if not harder when they lose their pedestal. Stranded on a cold street corner, he wrapped his threadbare jacket around himself, recalling with bitter nostalgia the nights of tailored suits and warm applause, unsure whether to laugh or weep at the irony. He wanted to blame the system, the judge, the tabloids, but an unspoken truth nagged at him, reminding him that his free will had guided every unethical choice along the way. As days of job hunting led nowhere, he felt a numbness seep in, convincing him he had no place in this new, harsher reality that greeted him with closed doors and contemptuous eyes. The more he roamed the city, the more he understood the precariousness of life, how quickly it was possible to fall from security to the brink of destitution. Yet in the silent hours of the night, as he shivered on forgotten benches, a tiny voice insisted there had to be a reason for his downfall, that perhaps circumstances were unfolding as they must. That thought both terrified and comforted him, for it offered a hint of cosmic purpose while also denying him the clarity of a straightforward tragedy. Restlessness became his companion, fueling a need to keep moving, to keep searching for any port in a relentless storm of shame and regret. In fleeting moments he felt a strange sense of gratitude that his mistakes were so public, because they left him nowhere to hide from himself, forcing him to confront the very moral vacuum he had occupied for so long. He did not realize it then, but each misstep, each harsh lesson, was propelling him toward a future that required his presence in a specific place at a specific time, by a riverbank where a child's life would hang in the balance. Only later would he reflect on how fate orchestrates even our darkest hours to shine light on our truest purpose, a purpose built upon humility, compassion, and faith in something greater than ambition. Even so, in that moment, all he knew was the sting of shame and an ache in his gut that spoke of an empty wallet and an emptier future, closing out the final chapter of his old life and leaving him with a single, though dim, spark of hope for whatever might come next. Homeless and unseen, he awoke to the scratchy sensation of coarse fabric against his cheek, a second-hand blanket that barely protected him from the crisp morning air drifting through the bustling streets. Hunger pinched his stomach the moment his eyes opened, and for a fleeting second, he imagined himself back in the well-furnished luxury of his old apartment before reality reasserted its cold dominion. In an effort to escape the constant shame that gnawed at him, he often tried to keep moving, drifting from one district of the city to another, hoping to lose the cloud of disgrace trailing him wherever he went. Exhaust fumes and the relentless cacophony of car horns transformed the once vibrant urban sprawl into a concrete wilderness that seemed to mock his every step. Some days the sidewalks felt narrower than he remembered, constricting him in a tide of people who were all too eager to avoid eye contact, as though homelessness were a contagion they feared might be catching. Intermittent gestures of kindness, like a half-eaten sandwich silently dropped into his lap or a murmured blessing from a passing stranger, reminded him that compassion still existed in a world that otherwise refused to acknowledge him. Still, those moments were dwarfed by the accusatory glares and averted gazes that made him feel like a stain on society, an unwelcome reminder of how fragile comfort could be. Rain-soaked cardboard substituted for the bed he could no longer afford, leaving him shivering beneath dimly lit doorways, wrestling with the same nightmares that once woke him in silk sheets. He clutched a battered briefcase that carried the last vestiges of a time when the weight of evidence and sealed documents had shaped his world, though now it simply held a frayed shirt, a pair of shoes with gaping soles, and a photo of him beaming in his old office. Each morning he reminded himself that though everything outwardly had changed, an ember of resilience still flickered deep within him, prompting him to rise no matter how many times he collapsed under exhaustion or despair. Occasionally he would meander near the district courthouse, as though compelled by some invisible tether to the place where his ambitions had once soared, feeling a strange mixture of sorrow and homesickness at the sight of dark-suited attorneys hurrying up the grand marble steps. His reflection in the polished pillars repulsed him, reminding him of the dissonance between who he had been and who he had become, a duality that left him feeling both contrite and defiant. Pride still poisoned him some days, urging him to believe that he deserved better than the ragged existence he now led, while guilt countered by whispering that this was his penance for the misdeeds that brought him here. He learned to shield himself from scorn by adopting a guarded stare and shifting into the flow of foot traffic without complaint, hoping anonymity might spare him from humiliation. Yet anonymity offered little solace. He might have preferred open hostility over the crushing sense of invisibility that swallowed him hour after hour. What scraps of spare change he managed to accumulate typically vanished into the cheapest sustenance he could find, but never enough to fully stave off the hunger gnawing at his core. In moments of profound weakness, he remembered the moral lines he had crossed, convincing himself that if this was cosmic justice, he must endure it without complaint, however agonizing it felt. Sometimes he would slip into a local library when the weather turned unbearably hostile, losing himself for hours among dusty shelves, reading legal textbooks that once defined his world, only now his perspective was tinged with sorrow and regret. He noticed how quickly people would take a step back or cast a suspicious glance if they suspected he was lingering too long in their vicinity, as if his very presence could tarnish their day. Hidden among the stacks, he would read dog-eared pages on old legal precedents, half hoping he might find some secret path to redemption, yet he realized that no text could fix the ruins of his reputation. Desperate for companionship, he tried to strike up conversations with fellow wanderers who gathered beneath overpasses, sharing stories of lost jobs, addiction battles, or estranged families, forging fragile bonds over shared adversity. Though many parted ways as quickly as they'd arrived, those interactions taught him that countless others had fallen off society's radar, reduced to ghosts drifting through the city's underbelly. On days when despair weighed heavily, he would traverse to the outskirts, seeking a corner of nature to remind him that the universe was infinitely larger than his personal failings. He would sit by a dried-up creek bed, fingering the cracked earth as if searching for an answer from the silent world around him, longing for a sign that he was not utterly forsaken. Some nights, after fruitless attempts to sleep through the noise of a never-silent metropolis, he would slip into a late-service church, drawn in by the soft glow of candlelight and the faint echoes of solemn hymns. Kneeling in the back pew, he often found his chest tight with a remorse he couldn't fully articulate, lips trembling with half-formed prayers that revealed more longing than faith. Although the sermons sometimes spoke of redemption and second chances, he feared he had exhausted both, convinced that divine grace might be too distant for a soul as stained as his. The sting of isolation cut deeper than any physical discomfort, for it robbed him of the dignity of being seen and treated as a human with a story rather than a nameless face on the fringes of society. Beneath the city's neon glow, he stumbled upon alleyways teeming with the detritus of everyday life, discarded cups, half-eaten meals, abandoned clothing, realizing that, in some twisted sense, he too had become refuse, tossed aside by a system that once applauded him. Subtle signs of his old identity still surfaced when he instinctively recited legal jargon in his mind, as though conjuring a defense for his new circumstances, only to abandon the effort when he recognized its futility. On the rare occasions he mustered the courage to contact an estranged acquaintance, he was met with either voicemail silence or politely manufactured excuses, reinforcing his sense that no lifeline would emerge from the circles he once called home. Even so, in the corners of his wandering he sometimes witnessed acts of anonymous charity. A stranger giving away a coat, a coffee shop employee handing a free cup to a freezing man, sparking a cautious hope that humanity wasn't entirely heartless. Clutching those glimpses of goodness like a precious secret, he forged ahead, compelled by the idea that he might yet find redemption, that fate wasn't done with him despite his dire state. When the monotony of hunger became too overwhelming, he would volunteer at soup kitchens, hoping that by working for a meal he could reclaim a scrap of dignity and in turn offer compassion to others in need. There he encountered people who reflected his own downfall, their stories sometimes darker, sometimes not as dire, but each one marked by tragedy, loneliness, and the faint spark of survival. He discovered that recognizing another's suffering brought his own into sharper relief, granting him a strange clarity he couldn't find in the isolation of a cramped alleyway. Witnessing mutual aid among those who had next to nothing illuminated a lesson he had overlooked in his privileged days, that real empathy often thrives in the darkest corners, unobserved by an indifferent world. Night brought the terror of vulnerability as the streets were less forgiving beneath flickering lamps, and the knowledge that a single wrong encounter could spell disaster haunted every step. Curling up near the entrance of a homeless shelter might earn him a few hours of restless sleep, but capacity was limited, and his luck was inconsistent, leaving him to brave the elements more often than not. Memories of plush pillows and central heating mocked him in those icy hours, but they also stirred a glimmer of pride in how much he had endured without completely giving in to despair. In fleeting moments of introspection, he wondered if some omnipotent force had orchestrated his downfall to teach him humility, to strip him of pretense and reveal a deeper truth he had long avoided. With no one to impress and nothing to lose, he peeled away the layers of his past, searching for the remnants of the morality he had once possessed before ambition corrupted him. He realized that without power or prestige to cloak his insecurities, he was forced to confront a raw, unfiltered version of himself that both frightened and intrigued him. Sometimes, while huddled in a doorway at dawn, he would muse that this desolate journey might be shaping him for something that required every ounce of suffering he now collected. Though he didn't know it yet, a critical moment loomed in his future, one that would demand a bravery he didn't think he possessed. A bravery he was unwittingly cultivating through nights spent battling hunger and bone-deep cold. Even as uncertainty pressed on him like a massive weight, he clung to flickers of defiance, refusing to let cynicism completely rob him of a future he couldn't yet envision. Distant laughter from late-night revelers or early commuters on their way to high-rise offices sometimes triggered pangs of resentment, but those pangs dulled faster than before, replaced by a new willingness to accept his circumstances. He recognized that the city's pulse did not revolve around him, yet it offered endless stories of downfall and recovery if one only cared to look beneath the surface. Each meager meal, each night spent under the watchful eye of streetlights, prepared him in subtle ways he couldn't describe, reminding him that life endures even in its cruelest seasons. Though he continued to grapple with the legacy of his ruin, something deeper, perhaps faith, perhaps sheer survival instinct, told him that his story was far from over. And so he pressed on, footsteps weary but resolute, drawing closer each day to that pivotal moment by the river, where destiny would meet him at his lowest point and reveal why he had to be there, exactly when a child's life hung in the balance. He didn't dare articulate the hope that tried to blossom in his chest, afraid that naming it would cause it to vanish, but it guided him nonetheless, step after lonely step. Everywhere he turned, he found signs that the world was more than the cruelty of his circumstances. It was also a web of connections, chances, and miraculous timing, waiting for him to play his part. That knowledge, however faint, kept him breathing through the torment of hunger and humiliation, certain that there was a design behind it all, even if he couldn't yet glimpse its full shape. A glimmer of faith, he discovered that even in the bleakest of circumstances, a faint whisper of possibility could thread its way through the gloom, stirring echoes of belief he had once dismissed. Every morning, before the city shook off the haze of sleep, he found himself watching slender rays of sunlight creep across concrete, feeling a subtle warmth that transcended the chill in his bones. At first he attributed his new sense of solace to exhaustion, imagining that his weary mind was conjuring faint illusions in an effort to survive another day on the streets. Yet the deeper this sensation grew, the more he suspected it was a gentle reminder that if life could endure such harsh extremes, hope, too, might flourish in even the most neglected corners of his heart. A battered, second-hand bookstore he often passed after sleepless nights caught his eye one rainy morning, prompting him to slip inside with the intention of stealing a few minutes of shelter from the downpour. A musty scent enveloped him as he thumbed through theology texts and well-worn philosophy tomes, each page whispering of perseverance and the hidden strength that blooms when all else fails. Though he hadn't stepped foot in a church for years beyond the occasional nighttime sanctuary, a few verses lodged themselves in his memory, sparking the notion that perhaps an unseen hand had guided him to these very passages. Leaning against dusty shelves, he felt the strangest stirring of gratitude, an emotion he had not expected to feel given how much had been stripped away from him. The old man behind the counter seemed to sense his turmoil, offering a hesitant smile and a plastic cup of lukewarm tea without asking for payment or explanation. This simple act of kindness, freely given in a world that now treated him like a pariah, stirred the embers of something he couldn't quite name, a feeling that perhaps all was not lost. The more he reflected on his life, the more he realized that he had once fashioned his own accomplishments into a kind of secular religion, worshipping ambition and prestige above all else. Now, abandoned by the pillars he had once knelt before, success, reputation, wealth, he felt an unfamiliar emptiness, which paradoxically seemed ripe for a new kind of faith. A curious hope flickered each time he noticed the unassuming generosity of those who possessed nothing resembling his old status but displayed compassion far beyond any he had shown in his days of influence. Searching for respite, he gravitated toward the city's less-traveled corners, where the skyscrapers gave way to humble churches and half-forgotten chapels that offered warmth and quiet reflection. While guilt weighed on him whenever he considered his own complicity in forging dubious legal pathways, he found himself venturing into these sacred spaces, standing silently near the back rows as services commenced. The soft hum of prayer, the subdued glow of candles, and the mingled aroma of incense and old wood lulled his anxieties in a way he hadn't anticipated, as though a door had cracked open somewhere deep within his battered soul. Rather than feeling judged, he sensed a subtle welcome in these places, a whispered invitation to unburden himself of regrets he was just beginning to acknowledge fully. One evening he gathered the courage to sit through an entire sermon, flinching at every mention of sin and redemption, unsure whether the words might cut too close to the hollow place inside him. Instead of condemnation, he heard echoes of compassion in the preacher's call for renewal, for broken lives to find mending through earnest repentance and humble faith. Tears stung his eyes at the notion that his own savage fall from grace might serve a higher purpose, though he didn't yet dare to believe fully in the existence of a cosmic design. He walked out that night feeling lighter, as if some piece of the shame shackling his heart had loosened, allowing him to entertain the possibility that life might still hold opportunities for redemption. Restlessness, long his enemy, became a strange ally, propelling him toward outreach programs set up by various congregations, where he observed volunteers offering food and blankets without discrimination. Even if he didn't always partake, simply witnessing such selflessness awakened a yearning to participate in the giving rather than perpetually standing on the receiving end of pity. Unsure how to proceed, he lingered at the periphery, doing small favors like stacking chairs or sweeping floors after a meal service, tasks that cost him little more than a fraction of his waning energy but seemed to bring immense relief to overwhelmed volunteers. With each small contribution, a fragile sense of dignity blossomed, a reminder that even stripped of titles and power, he could still offer meaningful help, however modest. Sometimes, during these moments of simplicity, he remembered the weighty cases he had argued, the towering intellect he had brandished with such gusto, and realized how misplaced his priorities had been. Soft-spoken people who offered him hot coffee or a gentle smile stirred old guilt, but also coaxed out the better parts of his nature, a moral compass he had once buried beneath arrogance. Late at night, seated on a concrete step, he would study the skyline he used to dominate from plush penthouses, reciting half-formed prayers that rose from the tender root of faith now anchoring itself in his mind. He found himself trusting, however tentatively, that a higher power, or some guiding principle he did not fully grasp, could repurpose his suffering into something that would benefit another soul. Day by day he saw new patterns, fleeting coincidences that carried a sense of meaning. A timely encounter with a charitable soul, a vacant bed at a shelter on the very night the temperature plummeted, even a bit of unexpected cash left by a stranger who vanished before he could say thank you. Each small grace carved away at his cynicism, reminding him that life's tapestry might be far more intricate than raw ambition or the endless pursuit of victory. At times he hesitated to declare these phenomena as miracles, wary of leaning on faith too eagerly, but a persistent idea sprouted within him that his life had not diverged from its course by accident. Instead he began to see his downfall as a kind of descent into humility, a mandatory pilgrimage through hardship that might be refining him in ways triumph never could. When he assisted at a roadside emergency, merely offering a phone call to paramedics from someone else's phone, he felt a surge of purpose that momentarily eclipsed his hunger and shame. In that moment he tasted the heady rush of doing the right thing without calculation or expectation of reward, a radical shift from the manipulative mindset that once governed him. Carefully he started seeking out opportunities for small acts of service, helping an elderly woman cross a busy intersection, offering directions to lost tourists, even gifting a handful of coins he had collected to someone worse off than himself. Each gesture chipped away at the bitter cynicism crusting his soul, bridging the yawning gap between the man he had been and the man he was becoming. Whenever doubt tried to reclaim him, pointing out that no grand epiphany could undo the damage of his past misdeeds, he held tightly to the faint glow of conviction that every human story could be rewritten, though never erased. He recognized, too, that if he'd stayed on his old path, cocooned in material luxury, he might never have known the humbling power of raw survival, nor the tenderness that exists among those with nothing left to lose. It struck him that faith was less about elaborate rituals or dogmatic creeds and more about trusting in the transformation of the heart, which he had begun to experience one small step at a time. Certain days that glimmer nearly faded, threatened by hunger, derision, or the harsh realities of street life, yet it refused to die completely, kindled anew by each spontaneous kindness that reminded him the world was not wholly cruel. In one of his sleepless wanderings he passed a graffiti scrawl that read, "Your scars are the shape of your lessons," and he found himself unable to walk away from that simple statement, feeling it resonate in his bones. Surely his life bore innumerable scars now, each one shaped by pride, betrayal, or negligence, but perhaps these too were signposts to guide him toward a better version of himself. He began to pray more earnestly, not for wealth or restored status, but for the courage to face every day with integrity and compassion, traits he'd rarely valued in the past. This shift in perspective was subtle but profound, offering him a stable thread to cling to whenever he felt himself drowning in doubt or regret. Musing on his own journey, he realized that the seeds of faith had been there all along, overshadowed by the towering weeds of vanity and greed, and only by losing everything could he finally see them. A sense of expectancy filled his days, as though he were walking the edge of some great unveiling, waiting for a moment that would unify all his jagged pieces into a single purposeful whole. He no longer scoffed at stories of personal redemption, having tasted the very depths of desperation and emerged clinging to a fragile but persistent hope that something greater had orchestrated every twist and turn. Though he still carried shame for the damage he had inflicted in his old life, he now felt a new kind of responsibility. To be present, to be aware, and to stand ready should life demand of him a service no one else could provide. Late one afternoon, returning from a church soup kitchen, he paused at a rustling in the bushes, finding a stray animal that looked as hungry and weary as he was, and the simple act of sharing some leftover bread reaffirmed that empathy was a light that could guide him out of the darkness. Each day became a lesson in faith, trusting that even when he had no clear plan or destination, he was precisely where he needed to be, forging a new path that might eventually lead to an unforeseen miracle. And although he did not yet grasp the magnitude of the role he was destined to play on the riverbank, he sensed an undercurrent in his life, one that promised that his misfortune would not end in pointless ruin. Sometimes, in a fleeting moment of clarity, he believed that everything, his arrogance, his disgrace, his hardships, was merely a prelude to something significant that would one day require his complete transformation. Clinging to that sense of purpose, however abstract, he found the strength to go on despite the brutal nights and cold stares, secure in the knowledge that the spark of faith within him would prove stronger than he ever imagined. The moment by the river, the early afternoon sun shimmered on the wide expanse of the river, a surface so deceptively calm that it invited people to gather on its banks, gazing at the gentle ripples in admiration. Peter felt a curious tug of restlessness that day, as though some invisible force compelled him to walk farther than usual, past the congested downtown avenues and into the quieter edges of the city. He had no particular destination, simply a gnawing intuition that he must keep moving, a sense that something awaited him beyond the familiar streets that had hosted his daily struggle for survival. The clang of distant construction and the hum of midday traffic faded the moment he reached the riverside path, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves and the crisp sound of water lapping gently against the shore. He noticed families strolling, dogs scampering, and joggers weaving through clusters of passers-by, but his attention kept drifting toward the water, which sparkled under the sun's benevolent glare as though holding a secret. Drawing nearer, he recalled how in his old life he might have hurried past this view without so much as a glance, too occupied with lofty ambitions to appreciate the natural beauty now spread before him. Pausing by a wooden railing, he inhaled the freshness of the day, reminded of the quiet faith that had gradually blossomed within him, a subtle conviction that every moment was laden with significance. A child's shrill laughter broke through his reverie, and he turned to see a young girl no more than 7 or 8, chasing after a colorful kite that flitted and bobbed in the light breeze. She wore a red jacket and bright sneakers, her hair gathered in pigtails that bounced playfully as she darted to keep the kite aloft, and behind her stood a father figure beaming with pride. Peter felt a pang of bittersweet nostalgia watching them, recalling a time when he still believed in innocence and second chances as unbreakable certainties rather than half-formed fantasies. Even in that fleeting moment he sensed a renewed stirring of purpose, as though the child's laughter underscored the possibility that life was not solely about paying for past mistakes. He tore his gaze away to scan the shimmering waters once more, the gentle current swirling in languid patterns, its calm surface an invitation for passers-by to let their guard down. He noticed a short distance upstream, a cluster of large stones jutted into the river, forming a precarious ledge where the water gained momentum, churning in subtle but dangerous eddies. Something made him uneasy about that spot, though he couldn't articulate why, and he found himself drawn to wander in that direction, his footsteps slow and deliberate. A shadow fell across his face as the sun dipped behind a passing cloud, and in that moment, a sudden shriek of terror pierced the tranquil afternoon, freezing him where he stood. He whirled around to see the red-jacketed child by the rocks, her tiny arms flailing as she struggled to maintain balance on the slippery surface, an expression of panic etched into her features. Before he could fully register the scene, the girl slipped, her bright sneakers failing to grip the wet stone, and she plunged into the swirling water with a splash that shattered the hush enveloping the riverbank. Cries erupted from onlookers and the father, frantic with alarm, sprinted toward the river's edge, but his panic seemed to paralyze him momentarily as the current tugged the child away from the bank. Peter felt adrenaline surge through him like a bolt of electricity, driving his legs into motion despite the fear that hammered at his chest, reminding him he was neither a strong swimmer nor in prime condition. All at once, the flicker of faith that had been quietly growing in him ignited, compelling him to act, urging him to abandon reason and risk everything to save a life that dangled in imminent peril. The chilling water slammed into him the instant he flung himself off the bank, engulfing his body in a fierce grip that pulled him under, wrestling him with currents far more powerful than they appeared from shore. He surfaced gasping, desperately scanning for the red jacket bobbing amidst the foam, but his vision blurred with droplets and his lungs burned with the shock of the cold. A glimpse of red caught his eye a few feet away, and he thrashed the water with renewed vigor, urging limbs weakened by months of malnutrition to persevere in this singular act of salvation. As he reached her, the child's eyes were wild with terror, her small hands clawing at the air in a panicked attempt to grasp anything solid, and he realized she was too frightened to cooperate calmly. He wrested her into his arms, forcing himself to stay afloat while she kicked and struggled, the reflexes of a drowning victim making his rescue attempt a perilous dance on the edge of chaos. Though every muscle in his body begged him to surrender to the swirling current, a fierce determination anchored him, a resonance of the litigator who once tackled impossible cases, now redirected toward pure survival. He recalled scraps of advice he'd read somewhere about how to manage a frantic child in water, urging himself to keep her head above the surface no matter the cost to his own energy. Their progress was glacial, each yard gained threatened by the undertow that swept them downstream, and the roar of blood in his ears mingled with the child's gasps for breath. Time lost all meaning as he fought the unyielding river, the father's distant shouts blending with those of bystanders scrambling for help, but he focused solely on the precious weight in his arms. At last, a pair of strong hands gripped them both from the bank, pulling them closer until others joined in, forming a frantic chain that wrestled them out of the current's clutches. Peter collapsed onto the muddy ground, the girl half sprawled atop him as she coughed and choked up river water, tears streaming down her cheeks in disbelief at her narrow escape. A wave of emotion overwhelmed him as he realized she was breathing, her heartbeat steady enough that her father's sob of relief echoed in perfect harmony with the pounding in his chest. Bystanders crowded around them, a flurry of cell phones, exclamations, and trembling hands offering blankets and water, while someone in the background called for medical assistance. In that moment he felt an indescribable sense of liberation, a clarity that the path leading him to this brink was not a random punishment but the necessary journey to place him here at this exact instant. The father, tears staining his cheeks, clutched his daughter with one arm while grasping Peter's hand with the other, gratitude too profound for words etched onto his trembling features. Peter's vision blurred again, but this time not from the river's chill or fatigue, instead from the weight of understanding that, by saving this one life, he had also salvaged a part of his own soul he thought was irredeemably lost. Dimly he heard sirens wailing in the distance, though his attention lingered on the child's face, her wide eyes locked onto his as if she too recognized the gravity of the moment that bound them. Concerned onlookers tried to steady him, and he allowed them to drape a blanket over his shivering shoulders, all the while acutely aware of a radiant calm settling deep within him. He felt no need for accolades or cameras capturing his heroism. The only validation that mattered was the gasp of air the girl drew into her lungs, proof that his life still held worth beyond a litany of past failures. That single act, throwing himself into the raging water to rescue someone he had never met, stood as a testament that the fall from fortune and the grim trials of homelessness had led him, inexorably, to this fateful riverbank where his fragile faith became a living, breathing reality. Awakening and redemption, he spent several days in the hospital, recovering from the effects of his plunge into the frigid river. But more than his body was being mended as he lay beneath the sterile lights of the ward, reflecting on how one desperate act of compassion had forever altered the course of his life. In the nights that followed the rescue, he drifted between fitful sleep and raw memories of the child's terrified eyes, feeling both proud and uneasy, as though this redemptive moment was still too new to fully trust. The father of the child visited more than once, embracing him with tearful gratitude and bringing small tokens of thanks. A handwritten note from the young girl, a soft blanket, even a bag of fresh fruit that tasted like the sweetest luxury. Numb with exhaustion and still sore from the ordeal, he often found himself pressing trembling hands to his face, remembering the swirl of the current, the gasp of air, and the realization that fate had indeed placed him precisely where he needed to be. Though physically battered, he felt a curious lightness coursing through his veins, a sense of release from an invisible prison he had built around himself through years of moral compromise and corrosive ambition. It was in quiet moments, listening to the hum of medical machines, that he recognized a profound shift had taken root within him, reshaping his priorities and eroding the bitterness clinging to his soul. He no longer felt consumed by guilt alone. Instead, an emotional tapestry of humility, gratitude, and a cautious optimism replaced the endless spiral of shame he once accepted as his destiny. He realized he had traversed a path of self-destruction only to discover in one pivotal moment that the very qualities he thought he'd lost, courage, empathy, and moral fortitude, still resided within him. Discarding the belief that he was irredeemably tainted, he found himself praying in earnest, not just for his own soul but for the welfare of the child whose life he had saved and the countless other vulnerable people he had once ignored. Waves of relief washed over him when medical staff reassured him that his injuries, though painful, were not permanent, and that with rest and care he would recover fully. He saw with startling clarity that his plunge into homelessness, his slow awakening to faith, and his impulsive act of heroism were not random chapters of misery, but each a milestone guiding him toward a better, more authentic self. A stream of unexpected visitors and well-wishers, some of them nurses who recognized him from scandalous news stories, underlined his transformation by treating him with a warmth and respect he hadn't felt since the height of his legal career. Instead of recoiling at his past, they seemed to admire the tangible proof of his atonement, renewing his conviction that he might yet rebuild his life on a foundation more stable and genuine than superficial acclaim. Slowly, his strength returned, and each painful breath reminded him that being alive was no longer a burden but an opportunity to fulfill a purpose that extended far beyond personal gain. He spent hours in introspection, recalling case after case where he had once manipulated evidence or intimidated witnesses. And though remorse stung him, he vowed to harness the lessons of his downfall to help rather than hinder people in need. Each time he tried to articulate what had changed, he found words insufficient to capture the reverent awe he felt in recognizing that he had been poised for a defining moment all along, shaped by suffering to perform a selfless act. He understood now that redemption did not erase the past but transmuted it, converting regrets into stepping stones instead of anchors. He clung to the memory of the girl's tiny hand in his as he hauled her from the water, recalling how her terrified cries had awakened a part of him that could love more deeply and serve more wholeheartedly than he had ever allowed before. When the doctors finally discharged him, he left with an unsteady gait, but his head was held higher than it had been in years, for he carried not shame but the quiet pride of a man who had reclaimed his moral compass. Word of his deed had spread among local circles, some remembering him as the fallen lawyer, others knowing him only as the unnamed hero who risked his life for a drowning child, and this new narrative of his identity both comforted and humbled him. He felt no urge to exploit his heroism for personal advantage. Gone was the desire to grandstand or polish his reputation with shallow gestures, and instead he yearned to honor the spark of faith that had guided him through adversity. Though he still lacked a formal home, the father of the rescued child offered him a spare room for a while, insisting that he repay the selfless act in whatever form he saw fit, a proposition that astonished him with its generosity. That small room, furnished with a simple bed and a single lamp, became a sanctuary, not unlike a monastery cell where he could quietly reflect on his next steps, forging a plan that would combine his legal knowledge with a newfound moral clarity. Deep in the night, he sometimes rose from that bed, standing by the window to observe the city's lights, determined to use his second chance to bring a measure of good into a world he once exploited for profit. He started volunteering at local shelters, offering advice on legal rights to people who had been evicted or faced charges they didn't understand, discovering that his intellect finally found its proper place when employed in compassionate service. Few of these struggling individuals recognized him as the once lauded attorney who had led such a flashy lifestyle, but their grateful smiles reminded him that real fulfillment arose from making tangible differences in people's lives. In these acts of humble service, he felt a redemption more authentic than any applause he had received when his name still sparkled in legal journals. At times, guilt returned in fleeting waves, for he could not simply blot out the memory of families he had harmed through manipulative tactics, but now he chose to channel that guilt into constructive atonement, determined to pay forward the mercy he had been shown. Observing the resilience of those who had survived greater hardships than he began to inspire him, each human triumph over adversity standing as a testament to the power of hope. Embracing his role as a caretaker for those whom the system overlooked, he realized that while he might never again don the elegant robes of a courtroom professional, he could wield his knowledge to tilt the scales of justice toward the vulnerable. This passion for service surprised even him, surfacing like an inherited instinct that had lain dormant, finally freed by the crucible of shame and hardship that had once threatened to destroy him. When donations permitted, he organized small workshops at the community center, teaching basic legal literacy to single mothers or impoverished seniors who had resigned themselves to navigating a maze of bureaucracy without guidance. Each session strengthened the conviction that destiny had orchestrated his fall from grace, prying him out of an ivory tower and sending him to the precise crossroads where faith met practicality. As he looked around the room at earnest faces, he recalled the child's father whose gratitude had rekindled his own sense of worth, and he found that gratitude no longer made him uncomfortable but motivated him to strive harder. The ghost of his old arrogance sometimes hovered at the edge of his consciousness, tempting him to brag or to manipulate situations for personal gain, but his near-death experience in the water served as a powerful reminder of what truly mattered. Gradually, his circle of acquaintances expanded, including kind souls who saw through the jagged remains of his reputation and recognized the sincerity of his reformation, granting him a sense of belonging he had never quite felt before. While some people remained skeptical, suspecting that a man who had once sunk so low couldn't possibly redeem himself, he chose to meet their doubts with patience and humility, letting his actions speak louder than any defense he could formulate. Though the memory of the courtroom still sent a pang through his chest, he realized that genuine justice required more than polished arguments. It demanded empathy, compassion, and a commitment to truth. No longer burdened by a compulsion to prove himself, he found ease in admitting mistakes, acknowledging limitations, and openly crediting others for their insights. An unfamiliar yet liberating attitude for one who had spent years feeding on public acclaim. The child whose life he saved would sometimes visit him, her eyes alight with a hero worship he gently tried to dissuade, reminding her that anyone, including her own father, would have done the same. Nonetheless, her presence reminded him of that pivotal day by the river, the living proof that a single act of bravery could alter the trajectory of many lives, including one's own. Not all of his wounds had healed. Old acquaintances occasionally taunted him with cutting remarks about his scandal, or stiffly ignored him as though the transformation he claimed to embrace was merely a facade. But such encounters no longer crushed him, for he had discovered a wellspring of resilience, nourished by faith, that outshone the shadows of the past. Each new sunrise reminded him that redemption was an ongoing process rather than a single event, requiring him to live each day guided by the principles he had only recently learned to cherish. Rather than dwell on the lost opportunities and tarnished legacies, he pledged to focus on the infinite possibilities that arose from realigning his talents with moral responsibility. In the end, his life was no longer defined by the suits he wore, the money he earned, or the lofty cases he won, but by the courage and empathy he mustered in moments that demanded them. Standing on the threshold of a future he never imagined, he allowed himself to hope, not as a naive dreamer but as a man who understood how quickly fortunes could shift and how easily illusions could crumble. He knew he had been given a rare gift, a second chance that so many never receive, and even if his name was never fully cleared in the eyes of the public, he had found absolution in the only place that truly mattered, his own heart. A new foundation. He realized the path forward would require dismantling everything he once revered about himself, and so he rose each day with a humble determination to lay fresh bricks upon the bare soil of his life. The small room he inhabited offered him the simplest form of security, yet it was enough to awaken a sense of gratitude every time he compared its quiet sanctuary to the dismal street corners where he once slept. Each dawn, he made a habit of stepping outside to watch the sun climb above the city skyline, believing that greeting the new light mirrored his own emergence from darkness and set the tone for the work ahead. Seeking structure and direction, he began volunteering more extensively at the community center, discovering that the vulnerability of those who walked through its doors echoed many chapters of his own downfall. He established a makeshift legal advice corner, a rickety table adorned with a few salvaged law books, where he guided single mothers through custody forms or translated convoluted legal jargon for the elderly who feared eviction. At first, he encountered skepticism from those who recognized him from scandalous headlines, but as the weeks turned into months, his patient dedication won over even the most doubtful. He often found himself on the brink of tears when he witnessed individuals, trembling with anxiety, leave his table wearing a cautious smile of relief, their burden lightened through the knowledge he provided. Yet his new responsibilities did not shield him from recurring pangs of regret. Each time he recounted legislative clauses or procedural steps, he remembered how he once twisted the law for personal gain. Despite the occasional sting of shame, he refused to let it discourage him, accepting that the memory of his past misdeeds served a crucial purpose. It reminded him never to stray from empathy and integrity again. Outside of the center, he participated in food drives and clothing collections, lugging heavy boxes alongside other volunteers, many of whom never suspected he had once owned a luxury penthouse. Whenever passers-by acknowledged the group's efforts with a nod or spare change, he felt the same warm current that had surged through him when he jumped into the river to save that little girl, a tangible reminder that each of us held the power to effect change. Though he spoke little of his personal story, word of his redemption circulated quietly, inspiring whispered rumors that the disgraced lawyer who had fallen so far might yet prove to be a champion for the downtrodden. Some who recalled his courtroom days labeled him a fool for working without pay, but he learned to distinguish genuine concern from veiled condescension, dismissing the latter with a peaceful smile. With time, he built a small network of social workers and public defenders who appreciated his legal expertise, inviting him to brainstorming sessions on how to expand the reach of pro bono services to the city's neglected neighborhoods. His days filled up with research, drafting letters, and filing motions under the supervision of licensed attorneys who understood the complexities of his disbarment but valued his determination to help. There were limits to what he could accomplish in a formal capacity, yet he swiftly adapted, channeling his abilities into supporting roles that proved just as vital to the cause. On the weekends, he found solace in organizing a gathering called Second Chance Saturdays, an informal workshop inviting anyone, ex-cons, recovering addicts, or those burdened by past failures, to share resources and experiences aimed at forging a better future. Here he recited legal tips for restoring basic rights, listened to tales of hardship, and even offered heartfelt confessions of his own missteps, trusting that honesty bridged gaps more effectively than polished rhetoric. The group's attendance grew steadily as word spread, culminating in a sense of unity that transcended the stigma each attendee carried, galvanizing them with hope and mutual respect. Through these exchanges, he realized that while his credentials had been stripped away, his calling remained intact, not to uphold the letter of the law but to harness it to protect the powerless. He adopted a personal motto that encompassed both his transformation and the spirit of the work. Redemption is a journey best walked together. Embedding that philosophy into every conversation, he took the time to celebrate others' small victories, whether it was someone finding stable housing, regaining custody of their child, or overcoming addiction. In these triumphant moments, he glimpsed reflections of his own rebirth, each success story reinforcing his dedication to forging an ever-stronger moral foundation. Despite their focus on service, he and his allies faced ongoing hurdles, from lack of funding to bureaucratic red tape. Yet these challenges only steeled his resolve to persevere, teaching him that real progress demanded relentless determination. The father of the drowning child occasionally accompanied him on volunteer missions, hauling boxes of donated items or translating for those who struggled with English, forging an unlikely friendship rooted in gratitude and mutual respect. The girl, still young, would stop by with homemade thank you cards, her bright smile a radiant beacon that never failed to remind him how one decisive act had changed both their lives. Sometimes he felt ghostly pangs of nostalgia for his old ambition, but he recognized this as a fleeting longing for recognition rather than a genuine desire to return to his former lifestyle, filled with moral ambiguity and shallow accolades. Instead of chasing headlines, he measured his achievements by the stories of people he'd aided, each victory substantial even if it never made the front page of a newspaper. Gradually, city officials took note of his initiatives, culminating in hesitant invitations for him to speak at town halls on issues like homelessness and the need for accessible legal support, a platform he approached with sincerity rather than the polished showmanship of his past. Standing before modest crowds in stuffy public meeting spaces, he shared how faith and failure led him to a higher purpose, unafraid to recount his collapse, so long as others gleaned hope from the honesty of his confession. He noticed that each retelling of his downfall felt less like self-flagellation and more like a vital piece of the story that testified to the resilience of the human spirit. The applause he received afterward no longer served as fuel for his ego but as an affirmation that he was finally using his voice for the right reasons. With each new partnership formed, be it with grassroots organizations, small businesses, or local churches, he inched closer to his vision of a community where empathy eclipsed personal gain. Though the memory of courtrooms with marble pillars and spectators in tailored suits lingered in his mind, he preferred the worn floors of community centers and the earnest gazes of real people struggling to navigate a complex world. He took solace in quiet nights, reflecting on all he had lost and gained, the entire spectrum of experiences reframed by the lens of gratitude and devotion. The downward spiral that had once stripped him of every worldly advantage now revealed itself as a path that refined his soul, leading him toward a more sustaining form of success. He felt free from the oppressive weight of his reputation, unconcerned with external measures of worth. Instead, he reveled in the unassuming satisfaction of ensuring someone's rights were protected or their worries alleviated. Where once he had crafted clever defenses for dubious clients, he now composed letters to landlords pleading for mercy on behalf of single mothers, each pen stroke an act of solidarity with those he had once neglected. He recognized that forging a new foundation was not a finite task but an ongoing project, a perpetual commitment to growth, humility, and service that stretched far beyond any conventional career. Through this unwavering dedication, he replaced the brittle pillars of pride with the resilient structure of empathy, supporting not just himself but everyone who leaned on the resources he and his peers tirelessly built. He made peace with the reality that some would never forgive him for his former sins, but he found contentment in knowing his present choices were guided by a moral compass he had once deliberately ignored. In time, he began to see how the intangible threads of faith and destiny had intertwined all along, crafting a life story that transformed disgrace into a vessel for compassion. Nothing about his days was easy, but the struggle felt strangely beautiful compared to the hollow triumphs of his legal heyday, because every drop of sweat and every moment of doubt served a tangible good. While his heart still bore scars from the intense loneliness of the streets, they reminded him that he understood desperation firsthand, and this empathy fueled the patience needed to walk beside those who felt overlooked or unworthy. In short, he became an advocate in the truest sense, not empowered by a license or the prestige of a firm's name but by an unshakable calling to uplift those battered by the system he once gamed for profit. At last, he could gaze upon his reflection in the darkened windows of city buildings without cringing, for he recognized in his eyes not the arrogance of a prodigy but the steady warmth of a man at peace with his chosen path. Though the money was scarce and the hours long, he could not imagine trading the sense of fulfillment he had discovered for any corner office or corporate retainer. And when doubts haunted him in the late hours, he found comfort in the unwavering truth that every misstep, every heartbreak, every frantic scramble for survival had led him to the precise space where faith and redemption became real. In that knowledge, he walked forward with confidence, aware that the law might never welcome him back into its elite circles, but secure in the conviction that he had found a new kind of justice, an earnest human justice as pure as the river that tested his resolve. He carried the memory of a child's life saved, of a father's tears, of community doors opened in trust, each one representing a milestone in the construction of his new foundation. Striding through streets once filled with shame, he now encountered them as fertile ground for acts of kindness, bearing witness that the greatest triumph of all was not found in a courtroom verdict but in the transformation of a heart awakened by love.